The soft hum of machinery filled the sleek corridors of the Galactic Unity Academy, a place where species from across the stars gathered to learn, cooperate, and share knowledge. Jack, one of the few humans at the Academy, had grown accustomed to the constant feeling of being different. Amongst the colorful alien races with scales, tentacles, and forms Jack could barely describe, his plain, unchanging human appearance seemed dull. Jack sighed as he opened the door to his room after a long day of classes. Galactic history had been particularly grueling, and all he wanted was to relax. The weight of his backpack dropped to the floor with a thud, and he threw himself onto the bed, the cool metal walls reflecting the soft light from the lamps scattered around the room. Just as his eyes started to close, he heard the door to his room hiss open. Jack shot up, confused, as he was sure he hadn't invited anyone in. The door closed, and before him stood Zara, an alien classmate from his xenobiology course. Zara's species, the Chaman, had iridescent scales that shimmered in a rainbow of colors. Her eyes were large, reflective orbs that seemed to absorb light and color all at once. Zara stood there, frozen, her scales flickering between shades of pale blue and crimson, a clear sign of embarrassment in her species. Her multifaceted eyes widened in shock as she looked at Jack, who was still lounging on his bed in casual attire. For a brief, awkward moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, Zara broke the silence. "Jack, I didn't expect. I mean, your door." Jack quickly stood up, grabbing his jacket from the side of his bed. "Zara. Oh, hey, why are you here?" he asked, trying to hide his confusion and slight embarrassment at being seen in such an informal state. Zara's scales deepened into a glowing crimson hue. I think I took a wrong turn. I'm really sorry." Her voice, although melodic, carried the unmistakable tone of panic. She gestured to the small device on her wrist that projected a holographic map. "I was trying to get to the lab for some extra practice, and I must have miscalculated the room coordinates." Jack smiled awkwardly, trying to ease the tension. "No problem. These hallways all look the same after a while." Zara's scales shimmered again, settling into a more neutral purple. "I didn't mean to intrude, Jack," she said softly, her eyes avoiding his. "I'm not used to interacting with humans up close, especially when they're not in full uniform." Jack chuckled, scratching the back of his head. "Yeah, I guess we do look pretty different. Don't worry about it. But if you need help finding your way to the lab, I can walk you there." Zara hesitated for a moment, but then nodded. "That would be appreciated," she said, her voice returning to its usual calm. As they left the room and began walking through the corridors, an unusual feeling settled over Jack. In the short time he'd been at the Academy, interactions with other species had always been distant and formal, but this encounter felt different. He couldn't shake the feeling that something more was happening. The journey through the dimly lit corridors of the Galactic Unity Academy was quiet at first, the hum of various technological systems buzzing in the background. Jack glanced over at Zara, her scales now a soft lavender as she kept her gaze straight ahead. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable, but there was a certain tension, as if they were both trying to make sense of the encounter in his room. "So, why were you heading to the lab so late?" Jack finally asked, breaking the silence. Zara's eyes flickered toward him, her expression unreadable. "I've been preparing for an advanced xenobiology experiment," she said softly, her scales shifting to a mix of greens and blues, signaling contemplation. "Our professor is hosting a series of extra practice sessions for those who want to delve deeper into the biological systems of silicon-based life forms." Jack raised an eyebrow. "That's intense. I've heard silicon-based life forms have some of the most complex biological structures in the galaxy." Zara nodded. "They do. I've been studying their regenerative capabilities, which are unlike anything we've encountered in carbon-based organisms. It's fascinating, but also challenging. I need every extra bit of practice I can get." As they turned a corner, the conversation drifted back to the unusual occurrence in Jack's room. Zara's scales glowed faintly with embarrassment again, and Jack couldn't help but smile at how expressive her alien body was. "Really didn't expect to walk into your room like that," Zara admitted, breaking the silence. "Humans are different from what I imagined. Your culture, your physical appearance, it's all so static, yet there's a depth I didn't understand before." Jack chuckled. "We may not have scales that change colors or eyes that reflect the cosmos, but we get by. I guess it's just another one of those things. Humans seem strange to everyone else, but we feel pretty normal to ourselves." They reached the entrance to the lab, where the door slid open to reveal the vast, sterile room filled with equipment, glowing containment chambers, and holographic displays. But before either of them could enter, an alarm blared through the academy, a shrill, metallic sound that echoed down the corridors. "What's going on?" Jack asked, his heart beginning to race. Zara's eyes widened, her scales flickering rapidly between purple and gray. "I don't know," she said, her voice tight with anxiety. "This alarm, it's not a drill." Suddenly, a voice boomed through the academy's communication system. "Attention all students, emergency protocol initiated. Please proceed to your designated safe zones immediately." Panic surged through the halls as students of all species rushed toward evacuation points. Zara's scales rippled with confusion and fear, while Jack's mind raced, trying to make sense of the situation. He reached out instinctively and grabbed her hand. "We have to move," Jack said, pulling her away from the lab's entrance. "Let's get to the nearest safe zone." As they hurried down the corridor, the lights flickered overhead, casting strange, distorted shadows. Jack's thoughts raced as he tried to comprehend what was happening. The Galactic Unity Academy was one of the most secure institutions in the known galaxy. What could possibly warrant an emergency of this scale? Zara kept pace beside him, her hand still tightly gripping his, her scales shifting rapidly in response to her heightened emotions. The hallways became a blur as they rushed toward the designated safe zone. But as they neared the security checkpoint, something caught Jack's attention. There was movement ahead, figures in the shadows, but these weren't other students. No, something was off. They were too still, too deliberate. "Stop," Jack whispered, pulling Zara behind a corner. "What is it?" she asked, her voice trembling. Jack peeked around the edge of the corridor, his heart pounding. A group of heavily armored figures stood near the entrance to the safe zone, their weapons drawn. Their armor was unlike anything Jack had seen before, dark, sleek, and pulsing with strange symbols that seemed to shift like liquid. "Who are they?" Zara whispered, peeking around Jack's shoulder. "I don't know," Jack replied, his voice low, "but they're not Academy security." The figures moved methodically, scanning the area as students who were unaware of their presence continued to flee toward the safe zone. Jack's stomach twisted in knots. These weren't just random intruders. Whoever they were here with a purpose, and that purpose didn't seem friendly. "We need to find another way out," Jack said, pulling Zara back down the hallway. "Where do we go?" she asked, panic rising in her voice. Jack didn't have an answer, but he knew one thing. Staying here wasn't an option. "There's a service tunnel near the West Wing," he said, thinking quickly. "It's not an official evacuation route, but it should be safe." Without hesitation, they darted down the corridor, hearts pounding, as the sounds of chaos and confusion echoed around them. Jack didn't know what was going on or who those figures were, but one thing was certain. They needed to get out of the academy before things got worse. Jack's footsteps echoed through the empty corridor, each step faster than the last as he and Zara raced toward the West Wing. The hum of the academy systems, once a comforting presence, now felt eerie in the midst of the unfolding chaos. Zara's grip on Jack's hand tightened, her scales shifting through shades of anxiety as they ran. "I've never seen anything like them before," Zara said, her voice low and tense as they rounded another corner. Those symbols on their armor, they looked ancient. Jack nodded, his mind racing. And the weapons they had, definitely not standard issue for any security force I've heard of. As they ran, Jack's thoughts kept returning to one thing. How had these intruders gotten into the Galactic Unity Academy? The place was a fortress, guarded by some of the most advanced security systems in the galaxy. Yet somehow, a heavily armed group had infiltrated it with ease. The corridor opened into a junction. Jack's eyes scanned the signs. The service tunnel was just beyond the maintenance wing, a little-known passage that he had discovered during his second year at the academy. It wasn't part of the official evacuation routes, but it was their best chance of avoiding the armed intruders. "This way," Jack said, pulling Zara toward the maintenance entrance. The door slid open with a quiet hiss, revealing a dimly lit service tunnel that snaked its way through the bowels of the academy. The air here was colder, the walls lined with exposed pipes and cables that carried the lifeblood of the facility. It was quieter, too. No rushing students, no alarms blaring, just the steady hum of machinery. As they moved deeper into the tunnel, the reality of the situation began to sink in. Something big was happening, something far beyond the usual academy drills. Jack's mind buzzed with questions. Who were the intruders? What did they want? And more importantly, how were they going to get out of this alive? "We should be safe here for a bit," Jack said, slowing down to catch his breath. "The service tunnels aren't on the main maps, so hopefully they won't think to check them." Zara leaned against the wall, her iridescent scales still flickering with nervous energy. "I've never been in this part of the academy," she admitted, her multifaceted eyes scanning the tunnel. "It feels different down here, quieter." "Yeah, it's not exactly a popular hangout spot," Jack said with a weak smile. "But right now, that's a good thing." As they stood there, catching their breath, a sudden noise echoed down the tunnel. A metallic clanking, followed by heavy footsteps. Jack's heart skipped a beat. Someone, or something, was coming. Zara's eyes widened, her scales flushing a deep, fearful blue. "Jack." Jack whispered, pressing his back against the wall and pulling Zara with him. "Stay quiet." The footsteps grew louder, closer. Jack's pulse quickened as he strained to see down the dimly lit tunnel. Shadows danced along the walls, distorted by the flickering lights. He could hear the low murmur of voices now, speaking in a language he didn't recognize. "They found us," Zara whispered, her voice trembling. Jack clenched his jaw. "Not yet," he said, trying to sound more confident than he felt. "But we need to move." Slowly, keeping low, they crept along the tunnel, staying as close to the wall as possible. Jack's mind raced through possible escape routes, but none of them seemed like good options. The service tunnel wasn't exactly designed for easy access to the outside world. It was more of a hidden artery that connected different parts of the academy's infrastructure. The voices grew louder, and Jack could make out a few words now. Though they were strange and guttural, the tone was unmistakably threatening. Whoever was coming for them wasn't here to help. "We need to find a door," Jack muttered, scanning the walls for any sign of an exit. "Something that leads up to the surface." Just as the footsteps seemed dangerously close, Jack spotted a maintenance hatch to their left. Without a second thought, he grabbed the handle and pulled it open. The hatch led to a narrow stairwell, spiraling upward into darkness. "This way," Jack whispered, motioning for Zara to follow. They slipped through the hatch just as the shadows of their pursuers appeared around the corner. Jack pulled the hatch closed behind them, wincing as the metal door clicked shut. For a moment, everything was silent. Zara's breath was shallow, her scales flickering in the dim light. "Where does this lead?" "I'm not sure," Jack admitted, "but it has to be better than waiting down there." They ascended the stairwell quickly, the narrow space making each step echo louder than Jack would have liked. As they climbed higher, Jack's mind churned with worry. Who were these people? How had they breached the academy's defenses so easily? Finally, they reached the top of the stairwell. Jack pushed open the door, and to his relief, they found themselves in a storage room filled with crates and equipment. It was quiet, too quiet. They were definitely not in the main part of the academy anymore. Zara peered around the room, her scales now a pale green, signaling confusion. Where are we? I think we're in one of the external storage areas, Jack said, stepping cautiously toward the door. It's connected to the outer maintenance section of the academy. If we can find a way out from here, we might be able to get off the grounds. But as Jack reached for the door handle, a voice crackled over a hidden communicator in the room. It was speaking the same guttural language as before. They're tracking us, Zara whispered, her scales darkening in fear. Jack's heart raced. They didn't have much time. They needed to figure out a way to escape, and fast. The tension in the storage room was palpable as Jack and Zara stood frozen, listening to the distorted voices crackling through the hidden communicator. Whoever was after them wasn't far behind, and they had to move fast. Jack's mind raced, trying to come up with a plan. This storage room was isolated, but it was connected to the outer edges of the academy's massive infrastructure. A potential escape route. We can't stay here, Jack said, his voice low but urgent. They're going to find us if we don't figure out a way out. Zara nodded, her scales rippling in waves of violet and dark blue. But where can we go? If they've breached the academy's security, they might have the exits locked down. Jack stepped away from the door, scanning the room. His eyes fell on a panel near the far wall. A ventilation access. It was small, but if they could squeeze through, it might lead them outside or at least to a less guarded part of the academy. "We're here," Jack said, motioning for Zara to follow. He approached the panel and pried it open, revealing a narrow vent leading into the academy's ventilation system. It wasn't an ideal escape route, but it was better than waiting for their pursuers to find them. Zara's eyes widened as she looked at the vent. "You want us to crawl through there? It's not exactly glamorous, but I don't see any other options," Jack said, glancing nervously at the door. The voices outside were growing louder, more insistent. They were running out of time. Zara hesitated for a moment, her scales flickering between apprehension and determination. Finally, she nodded. "All right, let's do it." Jack boosted himself into the vent first, the cold metal pressing against his arms as he wriggled through the narrow space. It was dark, with only the faintest light filtering in from the grates along the vent. But he pushed forward, knowing they had no other choice. Zara followed close behind, her movements agile and precise despite the tight quarters. Her iridescent scales cast faint reflections in the dim light as she crawled behind him, her breathing steady but tense. The vent seemed to stretch on forever, twisting and turning through the academy's infrastructure. Jack had no idea where it led, but he hoped it would take them closer to the outer perimeter of the campus, where they could find a way to escape. As they moved deeper into the system, the sounds of their pursuers faded, leaving only the quiet hum of the ventilation fans and their own breathing. After what felt like an eternity, they reached a junction in the vent. Jack paused, peering through the grate below them. To his relief, the vent opened into a large maintenance room, filled with old equipment and machinery. "We're getting close to the outer edge of the academy," Jack whispered, pointing to the room below. "This might be our chance to get out." He carefully unscrewed the grate and dropped down into the room, landing softly on the metal floor. Zara followed, her movements quick and fluid. They both crouched low, scanning the area for any sign of danger. The room was quiet, but the tension hung in the air like a heavy fog. "Do you think they'll find us here?" Zara asked, her voice barely audible. Jack shook his head. "I don't think so. The ventilation system runs through the entire academy. It's unlikely they'd be able to track us here, but we can't stay long. We need to find an exit." They moved cautiously through the room, keeping close to the walls and avoiding the main pathways. Jack's heart was pounding, his thoughts racing as he tried to figure out their next move. If they could find a way to the outer maintenance section, they might be able to access one of the emergency exits that led outside the academy grounds. As they approached a set of heavy metal doors at the far end of the room, Jack heard a faint beeping sound. His pulse quickened as he realized what it was. An alarm system. The doors were locked, and any attempt to open them would trigger the academy's security protocols. "We can't open these doors without setting off an alarm," Jack muttered, frustration creeping into his voice. "There has to be another way." Zara's eyes scanned the room, and she pointed toward a small control panel on the side wall. "What about that?" "It looks like a manual override system." Jack moved quickly to the panel, his fingers flying over the buttons as he tried to access the system. The interface was complicated, filled with alien symbols and codes, but after a few moments of tinkering, he managed to bypass the alarm and unlock the door. "Got it," Jack said, a triumphant smile crossing his face. "Let's go." They slipped through the door and into a narrow corridor that led to the outer perimeter of the academy. The corridor was lined with maintenance equipment and access points, but more importantly, it led to one of the lesser-known emergency exits. If they could make it outside, they might be able to escape before the intruders realized where they had gone. As they moved down the corridor, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The academy's defenses were supposed to be impenetrable. How had these intruders gotten in so easily? And why were they targeting students like him and Zara? Just as they reached the emergency exit, a loud clanging sound echoed through the corridor. Jack spun around, his heart racing, as he saw several of the armored intruders advancing toward them from the far end of the hall. Their weapons glowed with a strange, pulsing energy, and their helmets obscured their faces, giving them an almost inhuman appearance. "Go," Jack shouted, shoving Zara toward the exit. "We need to get out, now." Zara bolted for the door, and Jack followed close behind, slamming the emergency release button. The door hissed open, and they tumbled out into the open air, the cold night of the planet's atmosphere hitting them like a wave. But they weren't safe yet. The intruders were still on their tail, and Jack knew they had only seconds to figure out their next move. "Keep running," Jack yelled, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "We have to lose them in the city." The academy's sprawling campus was surrounded by a dense, alien cityscape, an intricate maze of towering buildings, narrow streets, and hidden passageways. If they could make it into the city, they might be able to disappear into the crowds and escape the intruders once and for all. But as they ran toward the city's edge, Jack realized that their escape was far from guaranteed. Whoever these intruders were, they weren't going to give up easily. The cold night air stung Jack's skin as he and Zara sprinted toward the edge of the academy's campus. Behind them, the shouts of their pursuers echoed ominously, growing louder as the armored figures closed in. The city's skyline loomed ahead, an intricate sprawl of towering buildings and bustling streets, but it still felt impossibly far away. "We're not going to make it if we keep running in the open like this," Jack panted, glancing back over his shoulder. The intruders were gaining ground, their weapons glowing with that same eerie, pulsing energy. Zara's scales shimmered with fear, but her expression remained determined. "We need to find cover," she said, scanning the area ahead. There, an alley between the buildings. Jack followed her gaze and saw a narrow alleyway tucked between two towering structures just past the academy's perimeter. Without hesitation, they veered off the main path and darted into the shadows of the alley. The dim light barely reached the ground here, casting long, dark shadows that twisted and shifted with every movement. They ducked behind a stack of crates, catching their breath as they listened for signs of their pursuers. Jack's heart pounded in his chest, his breath coming in ragged gasps as he pressed his back against the cold stone wall. Zara crouched beside him, her iridescent scales shifting to a dark, muted color to blend into the shadows. For a moment, all was silent. "Do you think we lost them?" Zara whispered, her voice barely audible. Jack shook his head, still listening intently. "I don't know, but we can't stay here for long." The city around them buzzed with life. Alien vehicles zoomed past on the streets beyond, and the murmur of distant conversations filled the air. But in the alley, it was quiet, almost unnervingly so. Jack's mind raced with questions. Who were these people? Why were they after them? And why had the Academy's defenses been so easily breached? Zara shifted beside him, her multifaceted eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. "Jack," she said softly, I think they were after me." Jack turned to her, confused. "What do you mean? Why would they be after you?" Zara hesitated, her scales rippling with uncertainty. "There's something I haven't told you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Something about my species, and why I came to the Academy." Jack felt a chill run down his spine. "Zara, what are you talking about?" Before she could answer, a sharp clang echoed from the entrance to the alley. Jack's blood ran cold as he saw one of the armored figures standing at the edge of the shadows, scanning the area with a strange glowing device. The light from the device flickered across the crates where Jack and Zara were hiding, casting eerie shadows along the walls. "Stay still," Jack whispered, gripping Zara's arm. "Don't move." The figure stepped deeper into the alley, the device in its hand emitting a low, pulsing hum. Jack's heart raced as he watched, barely daring to breathe. The intruder moved slowly, methodically, as if searching for something specific. Jack's mind raced. Were they tracking them somehow? Had they left a trail behind? Zara's scales darkened further, her body perfectly camouflaged against the crates. Jack tried to steady his breathing, keeping as still as possible. The figure was only a few feet away now, the light from the device casting strange, alien symbols across the ground. Suddenly, the intruder stopped, its head tilting as if listening to something. For a tense moment, Jack thought they had been spotted. His muscles tensed, ready to bolt at a moment's notice. But then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the figure turned and walked back toward the street, disappearing into the crowd beyond. Jack let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. "We need to move," Jack whispered, standing up slowly. "They'll be back." Zara nodded, her scales returning to their normal color as she stood beside him. "There's a place," she said quietly. "A safe house, not far from here. I have been keeping it in case something like this happened." Jack stared at her in surprise. "You've been expecting this?" Zara glanced away, her eyes filled with a mix of guilt and determination. "It's complicated, but if we can get there, we'll be safe, for a while, at least." Jack didn't press further. Now wasn't the time for questions. "Lead the way," he said, scanning the alley for any more signs of their pursuers. They slipped out of the alley and into the crowded streets of the city, staying close to the shadows as they made their way deeper into the maze of towering buildings. The city was alive with activity. Alien species of all kinds moved through the streets, their voices a chaotic blend of languages and sounds. It was easy to blend in, but Jack couldn't shake the feeling that they were still being watched. After several tense minutes, Zara led them to a nondescript building tucked away in a quieter part of the city. The building looked old, its walls weathered and worn, but there was something about it that felt secure. "This is it," Zara said, pressing her hand against a hidden panel on the door. A soft light blinked, and the door slid open with a quiet hiss. Jack followed her inside, and the door closed behind them, sealing them off from the noise of the city. The room was small, sparsely furnished with only a few pieces of alien technology scattered around. It didn't look like much, but it was safe, and right now, that was all that mattered. "We can stay here for a while," Zara said, sitting down on one of the small chairs. "They won't find us easily." Jack sat across from her, finally allowing himself to relax, if only for a moment. But the questions in his mind wouldn't rest. He looked at Zara, who seemed lost in thought, her eyes distant. "Zara," Jack said gently, "what's going on? Why are they after you?" Zara's eyes met his, and for the first time, Jack saw the fear hidden behind her usually calm demeanor. She hesitated for a moment, then took a deep breath. "There's something I need to tell you," she said quietly. "Something about my species that you need to know." Zara took a deep breath, her scales shifting to a deep, reflective blue. The dim light of the safe house glimmered across her skin as she met Jack's gaze. Her eyes were wide with an emotion Jack hadn't seen before, fear mixed with resignation. "My species," she began, her voice quiet but firm, "the Chairman. We're not just any alien race. We possess something, an ability, that most species in the galaxy don't know about. It's kept hidden, even from the Galactic Unity Academy." Jack leaned forward, his pulse quickening. "What kind of ability?" Zara hesitated for a moment, her eyes flickering with uncertainty. "We have the power to manipulate energy at a molecular level. Our scales, they aren't just for communication. They allow us to channel and redirect energy in ways that other species can't." Jack blinked, trying to process what she was saying. "So, you can control energy?" Zara nodded, her scales shimmering faintly. "It's a rare gift, even among my people. Only a few of us are born with it. That's why I came to the Academy, to learn how to control it, how to use it for good. But there are others who would use it for something far more dangerous." Jack felt a chill run down his spine. "The people chasing us, they know about your ability, don't they?" Zara's eyes darkened. "Yes, they're part of a rogue faction. An organization that believes they can harness my power to create weapons, to control the flow of energy across entire star systems. If they capture me—" She didn't need to finish the sentence. Jack could see the weight of it in her eyes. "How long have they been after you?" Jack asked, his voice low. Zara sighed, her shoulders slumping. "For years. My family sent me to the Academy to hide, to keep me safe. They thought I'd be protected here, but somehow, the rogue faction found me. They've been watching, waiting for the right moment to strike." Jack's mind raced as he tried to piece everything together. "That's why the Academy's defenses were breached. They didn't just infiltrate. They were after you specifically." Zara nodded, her scales glowing faintly with a mix of shame and fear. "I didn't want to drag you into this, Jack. You're only in danger because of me." Jack shook his head, a determined look crossing his face. "I don't care. We're in this together now, and I'm not going to let them take you." Before Zara could respond, a sharp beeping sound filled the room. Jack's heart leaped into his throat as he realized the source. It was coming from a small, wrist-mounted device on Zara's arm. She stared down at it, her eyes widening in alarm. "They found us," Zara whispered, her voice trembling. "They're coming." Jack stood up, his mind racing. "We need to move, now." Without another word, Zara grabbed her pack and followed Jack out of the safe house. The streets outside were eerily quiet, the city's usual bustle reduced to a distant murmur. But Jack knew it wouldn't stay that way for long. The rogue faction was closing in, and they had to stay one step ahead. "We can't outrun them forever," Jack said as they ducked into another alley. "Is there anywhere else we can go? Somewhere safe?" Zara shook her head, her scales shimmering with frustration. "There's nowhere else. No matter where we go, they'll find us. The only way to stop them is to fight." Jack's heart pounded in his chest. "Fight? How are we supposed to fight them? They've got advanced weapons and armor. We can't take them on by ourselves." Zara's eyes glowed with determination. "Not by ourselves," she said quietly, holding up her hands. "But with my power, we might stand a chance." Jack stared at her, unsure of what she meant. But before he could ask, a series of loud crashes echoed from the street behind them. The rogue faction was getting closer, their footsteps heavy and deliberate as they closed in on their position. "We're out of time," Zara said, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. "Jack, I need you to trust me." Jack nodded, his heart racing. "I trust you." Zara stepped forward, her hands glowing with a faint, pulsing energy. Her scales shimmered as the light intensified, growing brighter and brighter until the entire alley was bathed in a soft, radiant glow. Jack watched in awe as Zera channeled the energy, shaping it into a powerful shield that surrounded them both. The first of the rogue faction soldiers appeared at the entrance to the alley, their weapons raised and glowing with that same strange energy. But as they fired, the energy bolts bounced harmlessly off Zera's shield, crackling and dissipating into the air. Zera gritted her teeth, her entire body trembling with the effort of maintaining the shield. "I can't hold this for long," she whispered, her voice strained. "We need to find a way to take them down." Jack's mind raced. They needed to neutralize the soldiers, but they didn't have weapons, and Zera couldn't keep up the shield forever. Suddenly, an idea sparked in his mind. "Zera, can you redirect their energy?" Jack asked, his voice urgent. Zera's eyes flickered with understanding. I think I can, but it'll take everything I've got." Jack placed a hand on her shoulder, his voice filled with determination. "Do it." Zera took a deep breath, focusing all her energy on the shield. Slowly, the glow around her began to shift, changing from a protective barrier to something far more powerful. The energy from the rogue soldiers' weapons seemed to swirl around her, gathering in her hands like a storm waiting to be unleashed. With a single powerful motion, Zera thrust her hands forward, releasing the stored energy in a massive wave. The rogue faction soldiers barely had time to react as the energy blasts slammed into them, knocking them off their feet and disarming them in one fell swoop. The alley fell silent. Zera collapsed to the ground, her body trembling from the effort. Jack rushed to her side, his heart pounding. "Zera, are you okay?" She nodded weakly, her scales flickering faintly. "I'm fine, just tired." Jack helped her to her feet, his mind still reeling from what had just happened. They had done it. They had stopped the rogue faction, at least for now. But as they stood there, catching their breath, Jack knew that this wasn't the end. The rogue faction would regroup, and they would come after Zera again. The only way to truly stop them was to take the fight to them, to make sure they could never threaten her again. "We need to get off this planet," Jack said, his voice firm. "Find a way to stop them for good." Zera nodded, her eyes filled with determination. "Agreed. But first, we need to rest." And with that, they disappeared into the shadows of the city, ready to face whatever challenges awaited them next. The cold morning air bit at Jack's skin as he and Zera boarded a small, inconspicuous transport ship docked at the edge of the city. The ship wasn't much to look at, old, rusty, barely space-worthy, but it was enough to get them off the planet, away from the rogue faction that had been chasing them. Zera slumped into one of the seats, her body still recovering from the massive energy burst she had unleashed the night before. Jack sat beside her, his mind churning with plans for what came next. They couldn't just run forever. Sooner or later, they would have to face the rogue faction head-on. But for now, they had to get out of the system. "I set the coordinates for a neutral space station," Jack said, glancing at the ship's navigation system. "It's far enough from the academy that we should be safe for a while." Zera nodded, her scales glowing faintly with relief. "Thank you, Jack," she said quietly. "For everything." Jack smiled, giving her shoulder a reassuring squeeze. "We're in this together, remember?" The ship hummed to life as they left the planet's atmosphere, the stars stretching out before them in an endless expanse. Jack stared out the window, his thoughts drifting to everything they had been through. The academy, the rogue faction, Zera's hidden power. It all felt surreal, like something out of a dream. But as the ship sped through space, Jack knew that this was only the beginning. They had escaped for now, but the rogue faction was still out there, waiting, watching. And sooner or later, they would come back. "We'll stop them," Jack said quietly, more to himself than to Zera. "We'll find a way." Zera leaned back in her seat, her eyes closing as exhaustion finally took over. "I hope so," she whispered, her voice barely audible. As the ship soared through the stars, Jack's determination hardened. He didn't know what the future held, but one thing was certain. They would face it together. And no matter what challenges lay ahead, they wouldn't back down, because that's what it meant to be human.